Welcome to the Online Great Books podcast, brought to you by OnlineGreatBooks.com, where we talk about the good life, the great books, great conversation, and great ideas. Welcome to the Online Great Books podcast. Today, I've got a man that's coming on. His name's Joseph McCormack. He's written a book called Brief, Making a Bigger Impact by Saying Less. I was introduced to Joseph by our friend Malachi Walsh. Malachi's done a couple of podcasts with us, one about his career in marketing and how the great books have helped that, and another one about writing. Malachi's keenly interested in writing, and he told me I just needed to know Joseph. Joseph wrote a book called Brief. The tagline's Make a Bigger Impact by Saying Less, where he helps us learn how to speak and write with brevity so that we're more able to be heard and more respected when we speak and write. Joseph has been doing this stuff for over 20 years. He's done it in the business world, in the marketing world, and he also has spent many, many years teaching people in the special forces universe how to speak and communicate briefly. Because for those people, speaking and communicating briefly and concisely and letting their ideas known can be a matter of life and death, and Joseph helps them do that. So let's get right to this short show. Well, tell me, Mr. McCormack, why does brevity matter?
Brevity matters because people are overwhelmed with information. And if you can't learn how to communicate clearly and concisely, you run the risk of people not being able to hear you. It's a skill that people expect you to be able to do, but nobody teaches you how to do it. And I find in my experience in working with people that if they can't get their point across pretty quickly, people tend to move on to the next thing. Kind of like what you do with technology, kind of swipe and you go to the next screen, and they just move on. And it's unfortunate, but it's a reality and people have to adapt.
Yeah, so for you, and I've read your book, Brief, Making a Bigger Impact by Saying Less. That seems to be the crux of your argument, that you'll get lost in the noise. And I certainly agree with that because the world is noisier every day. But I also find that people just, even if I didn't lose them in the noise, and I'm like, I want to hear this person out, or I'm going to read this out, that they often can't make their point, even when I give them the gift of my attention. And that's the part that drives me crazy.
It drives a lot of people crazy. I've heard this definition of frustration is defined as an unfulfilled expectation. So you expect that, okay, I'm going to give a person my undivided attention. Tell me what's on your mind, what's going on. Whether if it's in a professional setting or a personal setting, you give a person and they can't deliver. Part of that is because the natural way people communicate is they speak and then they conclude at the end. And you're assuming that you can hold a person's attention that whole time to get to the ending. And what we're seeing right now is people need some assistance. You need to tease out. In journalism, they teach you like how to speak in a headline, give your point up front, like where am I going with this? And people, the natural way of communicating is you conclude, and you have to invert it, flip it. So, all right, well, what am I talking about? What am I trying to say? What is the point? What is the issue? What is my idea? And you state that up front. And then you get a person's attention, and then you can hold it. And I think you can teach that skill. That's the good news. Bad news is people, continue to do what you just described, and it frustrates their bosses and their clients, and people fall asleep, and they're like, well, why? And you're trying your hardest to focus, but you can't.
And it frustrates them. It frustrates the writer or the speaker because they ostensibly they have something to say, but they're not being heard, and it's really their fault.
Yeah, I mean, you're looking at, I think, a big with the onslaught of technology and how people relate to technology. It changes people's behavior. So you interact with an iPad or a phone in a very specific way, which is you do something and you expect a response. Like you click and something happens. That expectation has changed how people listen. So people are listening with a greater sense of, okay, well, if you don't tell me what you're saying, I'm not going to wait. It's unfortunate because, if you waited a little longer, but people need to be able to adapt to that. That new reality is, it's not just a Twitter thing. It's a technology thing. It's how we expect things to happen immediately. I call it in some cases, it's just kind of this desire of immediacy. I want results now. And we can't give it all, but we can give something to help people along,
Yeah, so many of the communications that we receive now are A/B tested. So well, I even do it at Online Great Books. If I send out 3,000 emails, we'll send out 1,000 of this version and 1,000 of the other version, and see which one people follow up on the most. And then so we run a test. So we test what we write to see how effective it is, that's a great luxury to have. But if you're just sending an email to your boss, you have one shot.
You can't. So there's some things to peep for. So in this, my backstory about why this book came about it's an interesting story. I got a call from the U.S. military a number of years ago, and it was within the special operations community. And the request was,
okay, I have to stop you already. How do you get a call from the United States Special Operations community in the first place? How does that work?
Like anything, there's a series of weird events. But I met a guy at a conference, 5-10 years prior, and he remembered me. He and I did some work together, very limited. He was not in that community at the time. He was in the sort of big army, big military, and then he got transferred into this community, and he was given a challenge. And what the challenge was is their people are communicating at a very high level when it's a lot of information. There's a huge time constraint. And they're not teaching these guys. They have a term, which is in the military, you do a briefing, which is the kind of a professional version of a presentation. And the expectation is a briefing is going to be brief, and they're rarely brief. Frustrating these guys and the people that they're talking to no end. So this guy thinks of, I met this guy once. Maybe he can teach us how to do this. So he calls me. And it really catches me off guard. So I start making trips down. I'm based in North Carolina now, near Fort Bragg, which is the headquarters of the Army Special Operations. So at the time, I was living in Chicago. So I started making trips down to North Carolina. And what I find is you have these people that are being trained in all these skills, but they're not being trained in how to communicate, and certainly not how to communicate concisely. So they're like, receive me with open arms, like, wow, this is great. Like, you're going to teach us the skill that people, they expect us to do, but we never taught how to do. And then I show up and I start teaching them how to do it. And I started thinking about how are we going to fix this problem? And then I decided to write the book and then build a business called The Brief Lab, where I teach teams how to do this. And my responses I hear from people, both military and professionals, is, I wish I had learned this 5-10 years ago.
So can you give us a few steps that we can use? I mean, of course, people need to go get your book and read the darn thing, but could you give us a few steps we can use?
There's a couple of really basic things that people can do. One is, don't assume that you have people's undivided attention forever. Assume that their mind or their circumstances around that will interrupt. There'll be some interruption, whether it's self-imposed or circumstantial. You're going to be talking to a person and their brain's just going to drift off. So you can't assume that you've got them forever. So you have to try to make it shorter. So example would be, all right, if I got 10 minutes, can I do it in 8? If I've got 30, can I do it in 25? So you're trying to trim or cut some of that down. There's plenty of room for cutting. A lot of what people say is just excessive detail in some instances that doesn't need to be communicated at that moment. It might be in a follow-up email or another conversation. So people try to jam way too much information in the time that they have. So my first step is, try to cut. One trick I do is every time I'm on the phone with somebody and I hang up the phone on my cell phone, I look at the time and I ask myself, could I have done that better? That's one thing. It's just the cutting. So you don't cut everything, but you start cutting fluff.
There's a quote. I can't remember. I think it's actually in your book. It said, was it Churchill? I can't remember. Sorry, this letter's not shorter, but I didn't have time.
Exactly. I would have written you a shorter letter if I had more time. So what that's speaking to is another thing, which is, so first is trimming. The other one is preparation. So how people start to take a little bit of time preparing what they're going to say. I find, because people are really busy in a corporate and professional environment, the same thing in the military, is people kind of run from meeting to meeting, and there's very little time to prepare what they're going to say. And many times people are saying things for the first time out loud without even thinking what they're going to say or who they're saying it to. And that's never a good idea. So I just did I have a podcast on thebrieflab.com called Just Saying, and it's on iTunes and Android. And I did one recently. It's about micro preparation. And the point of the podcast is some preparation is better than nothing. If you're going to walk into your boss's office or pick up the phone and call a customer, think for 30 seconds, what am I going to talk about?
Yeah,
and people are like, well, I don't have enough time. Something is better than nothing. And people are like, well, if I had more time, I would have. And that's the quote. Right. So trimming is one, preparation is another. And I think the third thing is just, listening more to people. And it's, because people are always waiting for their turn. It's like, well, let's have a conversation and let's ask questions and let's stop talking and hear what other people have to say and turn the tables. You can be brief by just not saying much, by listening more. And I think that's a big contributor to success, is being better listeners.
So clearly, a lot of your focus is on speaking and these presentations, and for the special operations community, these briefs. But I think that the book has more information in here about written communications, about emails and those sort of things. So I was looking at we're the Great Books Online Great Books podcast. So I was looking at some of these great books, that have been so influential. And here, a few of them that I've read recently. The Prince, Machiavelli's The Prince, 70 pages. People have been arguing about that for hundreds of years, and he got it all done in 70 pages. I read Hamlet not too long ago. In the edition I read in 50. It's a 4-hour play if somebody does the whole darn thing. Aristotle's Metaphysics is like 25 pages. I read an essay on mourning and melancholia by Freud, 11 pages. Like we see books like Harry Potter, and they look like phone books, There's these giant books out there, but some of the most important things ever written are just a few pages, really. When it's done well, so that it lasts and so that it actually communicates real ideas, it almost has to be brief.
I think one of the things, when I go back to like literature and things that have been written, long form. I'm not against long form writing. Sure. I think it's there's so many books that are just worth reading and reading again that are longer. So I'm not going to espouse like, hey, we got to go to short form. Certainly essays. I'm a big fan of E.B. White. He's got a book about his essays. They're just wonderful. 4 or 5 pages. When I think about, parables in the Bible, none of them are super, super long. They're really short stories that pack a punch, and there's a lot to be said in very few words. I think that the skill of writing, though, is there was a quote. I don't know exactly who said it, but it was a writer who was known for being a concise writer, which is a skill. To be a concise writer is a skill, because you get attached when you write to what you write, and it's hard to edit it. Mm. So when you write it and then you want to change it and cut it, you're like, well, I can't cut it because I said it and I wrote it, and then you become attached to your writing. So there's a dynamic of that going on. But when you look at concise writing, this guy said once, I cut out the parts that people typically skip. And when I heard that quote, I loved it, because being a good writer is it's saying what you need to say and you don't. And there's a book which I think is one of my favorite books about being a good writer. It's The Elements of Style by Strunk and White. So in that book, they talk about omit needless words. And the analogy they say is like in a drawing, you don't have unnecessary lines in the same way that you don't have in a device unnecessary parts. In writing, you shouldn't have unnecessary sentences or words. So it makes every paragraph, every word count, so that if it's long, you hold the reader's attention where the reader wants to read more. But it's not filled with fluff. And I think there's a lot of fluff in people's writings where they need to be better at editing and redacting and cutting, trimming their writing. I tell people, buy a box of red pens. At the end of the day, and start trimming stuff.
Yeah, when in doubt, it has to go.
Right. The editing term is kill off your darlings. Mm. These phrases that you fall in love with, but you can't let go. But the reader it doesn't help the reader. It's all about, at the end of the day, it's all about the reader. What are they hearing? What are they reading? What are they consuming? And right now we're talking to a society which is becoming attention starved. There's a deficit of attention, people's ability to sustain attention. And there's a real risk in writing long form that that genre might just go away. It scares the death out of me. It scares the death out of me. There's a book called Welcome Back Reader. I'm saying the name wrong, but basically it's the point of people can't read long books anymore.
Yeah, was it Marilyn Wolfe?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Reader Come Back or something like that.
Yeah. I used to own a business. I sold it in December, and I was talking to a friend of mine. We were talking about writing for business purposes. And he was saying, you got to write to this 8th grade level and so on and so on. We all hear that, right? That you should write in these simple terms on an 8th grade level. And to the point you just made about long form writing, that worries me too, because there are some ideas that are heavy enough that an 8th grader, you can't communicate them on an 8th grade level, right? There are some ideas and problems that transcend 8th gradeness. So what do we do? Like I mentioned a while ago, that we get to send out these communications that are A/B tested, and a lot of the communications that people get are tested in just that same way. So they get a lot of communication that has been tested. It is very high quality, at least for holding people's engagement. At least it's tested for that, and we have to compete against that, right? When you write your one-off email, you're competing against this stuff that's been tested for reading level, for engagement, and we're just sending a one-off email. And sometimes the ideas that we're writing about are difficult, and we have to write about them simply. And that's one of the reasons we actually formed this online great books thing. It's we want help. We want people to read beautiful writing and to learn from that. We want them to take in the ideas in these books and think about those ideas of justice and the nature of man and all of these things, but also just to learn from that example. And then when we go to these seminars, we speak about those things, and it's all extemporaneous, although you can do some prep. Like you said, you could do your micro prep. You're not sure exactly what's going to go on in the seminar, but we can try. And we're trying to give our people more and more opportunities to write. And so we now have a blog on the Online Great Books website where we'll publish what they write about their experiences and about what they're reading. And it's just it's very difficult to compete with all of the professional writing that's out there, from Netflix to the A/B tested emails that you get from whatever internet retailer you buy things from. I worry about how normal people will be able to communicate with each other in the future.
I do too. And I think there was a quote from Albert Einstein said once, "You don't understand something well unless you can explain it simply." And that quote has been attributed in a couple different ways. Like, if you can't explain it to your grandmother or an 8th grader, mm-hmm. I mean, the point is that in doing this work with the Brief Lab and writing the book Brief and then this business, one of the things that really kind of struck me was brevity forces clarity. If you force yourself to try to say it in fewer words and simpler words, it doesn't dumb it down. It makes it clearer. One of the biggest challenges in writing is people are trying to sound fancier than they are. And I ask the writer, because we do a writing course, what are you trying to say? Or in other words, and it gives them the freedom or permission to say what they're trying to say. And I think good writers are in the habit of, good writing is good thinking, right? So when you read these classics, it reflects these great thinking. But we have to adapt a bit, because making these insights about human nature, about these important matters, we have to make them accessible to people. So now you're starting to see people using a lot of metaphors, or they're using parables or stories. I mean, there's a book, it's by Patrick Lencioni, called The 5 Dysfunctions of Team. So it's a business book, but it really took off. Why? Because he's using a story as the vehicle. And one of the things that we talk about in our courses is using storytelling as a Trojan horse device to pack information inside of, because the listener, their brain is now in the mode of hearing a story, and they know how to consume, but you're not adding to the problem. You're trying to relieve it. And I think people right now don't need more information. They need more insight, and they need more. They need better writing. And it's just, I agree. I think you have to challenge people to, writing is hard. Thinking is hard.
Thinking's hard.
not just thinking about what you want to say, but how people are hearing it. And your point about A/B testing is right. I think that people need to spend even more time thinking, all right, if I said it that way, would people even hear it? And the reality is a lot of times they don't.
Yeah, it's a lot of times they don't, even if you have what you think is their attention. If you send an email to your boss and he has 20 people that report to him, you would think that you would have his attention, but you don't. You've got to come out of the gate swinging.
I mean, I would say I spent a lot of time thinking about this and working this problem, but if you think about when a person's in a moment of doing something difficult, like you're really pondering a very deep thought, or you're going through material which is pretty dense, and you've got a smartphone sitting right next to you, the temptation of going, well, it's like working out. It's like, all right, you're working out, you're in this really, really difficult moment where it's just hard. And you have something like, I don't know, what the analogy of like an ice cream cone or a couch sitting right next to you. Like, that's not a good idea. So if you've got something that might be easier and tempting for you to do the hard work, remove it. And really dial it. But I think people sit there and they've got music and they got their smartphone and they got all these easier options, and their brain has been rewired to go easy. And they bail. They bail on the hard thought. They don't go through the page. Like, I mean, think about how hard it is to read. Like when I was in college, I was an English lit major in the Canterbury Tales in the original, So I'm trudging through this every night. If I had a smartphone sitting next to me, I would have been done.
Boy, I suffer from that. I read the Canterbury Tales. I read a little bit of it in the original just a few months ago. And the fart jokes do come through.
Right.
But yeah, it was really tough. And I'm 44. And my attention span, I know that my attention span has plummeted in the last 8 or 10 years. And I fight it, and it's my job to have a long attention span. And I'm not winning that fight, man. I'm being programmed against my will, and I'm very unhappy about it.
It's a reality, and I am, at the end of the day, one of my motivations to write the book was not to, it wasn't to try to be cute about like we all need to be like Twitter. It wasn't that. It was an adaptive strategy, realizing that we're talking to audiences that are generally struggling to focus and really hold on to what we're saying. So if we don't say it in a shorter, clearer way, they may not hear anything or very little. So we have to, and the irony of the whole thing, and this is the good news that I've seen happen, is as people get better in being clear and concise, they actually win over the audience's ability to hear more. So I just did a podcast, for as absurd as it may sound, about Napoleon Dynamite. So, and the point of the podcast is it's the stupidest movie you've ever seen the first time, and the second, it's the most brilliant. And I talk about, how did they do that movie? And what ends up happening is it's a series of 45 very small scenes. There are no throwaway scenes. Each sketch is funny, and you're like, I watched one, I'll do another one. And it's kind of like binging, and you watch so what you do is you win the short form and you thread it into a long form. You win it paragraph to paragraph, sentence to sentence, and you basically win over the reader where they're like, this is actually feels short, but it's actually long. And the irony is you can actually create opportunities for longer conversations or longer writing.
That's really interesting, because that movie is so slow and quiet, but they hold your attention. You just hang on it, and people know it. People recite all of those lines from that movie because it's just so crisp.
There's a term that I'm using lately, and it's called focus management, and it's the skill to manage people's focus. So the analogy is magicians. So if you think about what a magician's doing, is they're expertly managing your focus and having you focus on the wrong thing so that you don't see the trick, right? So what we need to learn and teach people is how to learn the technique of holding people's focus around you. So there's tricks to do it, just like in magic or in comedy is another analogy. A comedian, they have these devices that they use that are proven to work time and time again. Setup, transition, punchline, setup, transition, punchline. And they follow this. It's got a cadence and a flow. It creates a resonance in your listening. And you can magically hold people's focus when they can't under normal circumstances. One of the things that I talk about is the brain doesn't right nowadays doesn't want to reorganize what you said in a better way. You have to do that for them. So when you do that, the brain's like, oh, this is great. You made it easier for me. And it gives a little dopamine. It feels good. And you're like, okay, I'll do it again. And when you start to use these focus management tricks, speak at a headline, cut out stuff that doesn't matter, insert a little bit of a hook, give a payoff or a punch, a conclusion, people love it. They just love it. And it really, it retrains the brain to just kind of sit through longer problem sets.
Yeah, those little tricks for holding people's attention. When I read Brief, I was thinking about a friend of mine named Brad, and he's a master storyteller, and we would be at a bar, and he would tell, we had another friend with us, and he would tell a group of girls, this is my friend Bug. I'll tell you how he got his name later. And then he would tell a different story, and they would sit there because they wanted to know how the guy got his name. And he always did that or something like that. And he was completely unconscious of it. He was just completely natural. If you ask him, what are all the tropes that you use to hold people's attention when you're telling stories at the bar, he had no idea. But
you can learn from people. You can sit and study those people and teach that skill. There's a number of them. One of them is a technique called flagging, and it's a simple technique, and it's numbering the points that you want to make. Okay, you go into your boss's office, you're like, hey, I got a big budget problem. There's 3 things that I'm saying. When you number it, the boss is like, okay, what was the first? It's like chapters in a book. That's a simple little thing. Every time you do it, it works every time. Another one you just mentioned is storytelling. Like, okay, let me give you an example. When you give people an example and you tell them a story, the brain's like, oh, cool, I get to hear a story. Calling a person by their name. In a conversation where they're drifting. I had a guy in our course a number of years ago in the military and special operations. We were doing a homework assignment, and he was talking to his wife, and the point was have a conversation with somebody and try to hold their attention for her. And she was just it wasn't working. And halfway through the conversation, he says, Kathy, I really, and then he says she was doing something and she stopped and just turned and looked at him. It was like snapping your finger. There's these little devices that natural people, you can study them and learn how to do them. We have to teach them.
Yeah. We all know how bad most of the communication that we receive, particularly in the workplace, is. So, you can imagine what kind of a star that you would be if you could transcend that. Like if everybody in your sphere of influence knew that you were someone that communicated effectively and enjoyably, even, that you would crush all of your competitors and hear the lamentations of their women.
I totally agree. I think the one of the things that I really push for people is this is a skill that people expect you to have, and when they don't get, they get frustrated. But if you have it, you stand out. I have seen people because people are dying to know what's going on, and everybody's kind of beating around the bush, and then you show up and you're like, all right, here's the deal. And you lay it out. You've prepared, you've trimmed, you've got it organized. People notice. They notice you, and they notice what you're saying when they're ignoring everybody else. That can be a huge catapult for people's careers. I mean, think about like you're trying to get somebody's attention, like an important client, or you're talking to your boss or whomever. Your ability to do that might be the difference.
Yeah. In a competitive situation like a job interview, they do 7 interviews and you're the one that held their attention for the 22 minutes. It's probably not a competition at that point.
It's not. I've seen it. It's not a competition anymore. So the good news is when people do the work, when they learn how to do this, they start to see a difference because the people around them are drowning and you're throwing them lifelines, and those lifelines are real. They're real, and people grab them because it helps them because they don't want more. They're already buried in information. They don't want more. Information inundation is a real thing.
So if you're listening to this and you don't think you're a good communicator, and you know some people who are, know that while they may be natural, you don't have to be a natural. This is something you can learn. This is something you can practice. This is something you can habituate into, and you can become a good speaker and a good communicator. You can, you can go get Joe's book. It's called Brief. His name's Joseph McCormack, McCormack. He's got some classes, some online courses. You can go to briefbootcamp.com and take some courses online there from him. What else do you want to pimp, sir?
Well, I think the book is the book. I wrote the book to help people be better. And it was, it took me a year to write it. It's been super well received. I think the book it can be a good starting point. The other thing is when you go to thebrieflab.com, we have a podcast. It comes out every Monday, and it's just about little things. It's a way for me to continue the conversation that I started with the book. So as people start to, because I want to support them, I want people to know that I'm in your camp. I want you to get better at this. You can do it. It takes discipline, it takes commitment, but it's possible to make a huge impact. And I think the podcast has been my, it's a little thing that I do. They're only 10 minutes long, 10 to 15 minutes long, but it's my contribution.
Yeah, you said you can help people be better. My wife and I, Joe, we tell each other sometimes, hey, you need to do better. And that's become a joke between us. And then you sent me a copy of this book, and it says in the front, Scott, be better, be brief. And I showed my wife, and she's like, yeah, you need to be better.
When I have to sign books for spouses, in one spouse is recommending the book for the other, in the second book, I always tell the other spouse, you can talk as long as you want.
Right. Excellent. So we've told them they can find you at thebrieflab.com and brief. Let me go look again, briefbootcamp.com. You got an email you want to give out in case somebody needs to find you and hire you and put you to work?
If you send an email to me personally, it's J McCormack. So it's McCormack at thebrieflab.com. I answer my own emails.
Excellent. We'll try to keep this podcast brief. Thanks for coming on here and talking to us about communicating. That is part of the trivium, right? We've got our grammar, logic, and rhetoric. This is the rhetoric chunk, and we want people to master all three of those pieces. So thanks for helping us do that.
My pleasure.